Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Supporting Children in the Aftermath of Disasters webinar. My name is Zola, and before we begin, I have a couple of brief technical considerations to share with you. First, for all general attendees, just using your computer speakers for the audio, please turn the volume up on your computer speakers. Next, to reduce any background noise, I ask that the presenters or anyone calling in please mute your computer speakers and ensure your phone is on mute when you are not speaking. All participants are free to type a question or comment in the Q&A pod anytime throughout the webinar. We will address them following the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please know that we are recording today's webinar and we will post it to childcareaware.org within 1 week. Also, the registered participants will receive a certificate of participation via email within 1 week. Any follow-up questions can be directed to preparedness at childcareaware.org. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Holly Nett to get us started. Holly?
Thanks, Zola. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Supporting Children in the Aftermath of Disasters. My name is Holly Nett, and I'm the Community Resilience Manager on the Emergency Preparedness Team at Child Care Aware of America. Thank you for your interest in this extremely important topic. As you are well aware, many children, families, and caregivers are dealing with difficult emotions related to hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and even human violence. Following disasters such as these, child care programs may be forced to close, rebuild, or in some cases never reopen, impacting all sectors of a community. As for young children who do best when their lives have predictable caregivers, schedules, and surroundings, the resulting emotional stress can cause developmental challenges with lifelong implications. Disaster changes lives, especially for children. Whatever type of disaster or trauma they have experienced, children often need support to process what has happened. Even in the most difficult of circumstances, children and families can find strength and resilience within their community and from nurturing caregivers. We're excited to have the expertise of Dr. David Schonfeld, one of the nation's leading experts in helping children deal with loss and grief, on today's webinar. It's been a pleasure to work with Stigma and with Dr. Schonfeld in preparing this webinar for you. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is the fourth session in a lineup of 5 webinars scheduled this fall on child care disaster response and recovery topics, sponsored by Child Care Aware of America. You can find the archived recordings and related handouts for the webinars that were held in September and October on Child Care Aware of America's Emergency Preparedness website, www.childcareprepare.org. Our final webinar in the series will be held on December 19th. We hope that you're able to join us to learn from representatives from FEMA and Good 360 about resources that may be available for child care programs to assist in reestablishing their learning spaces after a disaster occurs. You can find registration information on our website. Next slide, please. The Emergency Preparedness Team at Child Care Aware of America strives to help the child care industry prepare for disasters and recover in their aftermath. Child Care Aware of America works with over 572 child care resource and referral agencies from across the country, and they help communities understand the landscape of child care following an emergency. We invite you to learn about our work, register for our Child Care Emergency Preparedness listserv, and access a variety of tools and resources on our webpage. Next slide, please. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to today's guest presenter, Dr. David Schonfeld. Dr. Schonfeld is a developmental behavioral pediatrician and director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. Dr. Schonfeld is a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council, and he served as a commissioner for both the National Commission on Children in Disasters and the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission in Connecticut. Dr. Schonfeld has provided consultation and training on school crisis and pediatric bereavement in the aftermath of a number of school crisis events and disasters in the U.S. and abroad. Some of those include school and community shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, Marysville, Washington, Aurora, Colorado, Chardon, Ohio, and Townville, South Carolina. Flooding from Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and Hurricane Ike in Galveston. He's also helped with tornadoes in Joplin, Missouri, and Alabama, the Great Smoky Mountain wildfires in Tennessee, and most recently, the Las Vegas mass shooting. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Schonfeld. We're looking forward to learning from you today, and I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
All right. Well, welcome to everyone. So my talk is going to be really on how to support children at times of crisis. And I do want to say that I'm going to give examples from major disasters and crisis events. But what I talk about will be relevant even if a child is having an individual or family crisis. You don't have to wait for a major disaster before you use this information. I'm going to start by saying that I don't have any relevant financial relationships to disclose and won't actually be talking about any unapproved investigative products or medications. So I'm going to start by talking about how do you support children after a disaster. I'm going to go over some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see. Then I'm going to turn to the timeline for adjustment to talk about what is the process by which people recover from these events. And then I'm going to turn to professional self-care, and I will leave some time at the end for questions as well. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Zola to play a brief video clip. And before she plays that, I just want to frame what this is for. A lot of times when I go and speak with schools and other groups, they often, feel that they're being asked to do something outside the realm of their expertise. And so I wanted to clarify from the very beginning that I'm not talking about training child care providers or classroom educators or others to provide clinical interventions or treatment, but rather on how to be supportive to individuals who have been through crisis situations. And this 90-second clip of an educator talking about the type of support she provided to a student who had experienced the death of a parent, I think illustrates what I'm referring to as kind of an empathic presence. So Zola, if you could play the video clip.
2 years ago, I had a student come back from a funeral. And the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital and that's why he hasn't been at school. I said, oh, okay. So then when he came back, I said, Jonathan, he said, my mom passed. I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, Jonathan, and I hugged him and then I looked at him and I was going to lose it because my heart, your mother, and he looked at me and he goes, Jackie, please don't. And I said, okay. So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. We're all here for you. And my door is always open. And, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, thank you. And I look up from my desk, what are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know, thank you. And I said, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I can take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
So I like that metaphor because often what you are doing is just listening to the music with a child. And so it's not so much that you have to provide interventions, but rather you have to have an empathic presence with a child. And that can make a big difference in how a child copes and adjusts with an event. Now let me turn to some of the first steps that you use right after a crisis event. And one of the things that you'll hear a lot about is psychological first aid. And psychological first aid is something that you provide broadly to all of those who have been impacted by an event. It involves supportive services to foster normative coping and to accelerate the natural healing process. The point I'd like to make is that all staff should understand the likely reactions that children and adults may have to a crisis event and know some strategies and how they can help children cope with that event. The reality is that anyone that interacts with children can be a potential source of assistance and support, but if for some reason they are unprepared, particularly if they appear non-empathic, they can actually be a source of further distress to children and adults. I remember responding to one school crisis event. It involved a mass shooting that occurred in a school, and I was visiting the high school sometime after the event, and one of the groups that I met with were the cafeteria workers. And I asked the cafeteria workers how they thought the kids were doing, and they said that they were concerned because they had noticed that the girls were wearing long-sleeve shirts. And I asked them, why did they think that was a concern? And they said, well, they'll get on the lunch line, they hold out the trays, their sleeves retract, and we can see that they've been cutting more, but we don't think the mental health staff know that. Then I met with some of the custodians in the school, and they told me that they thought the kids were now out of control. So I asked them to give me an example of out of control. And one of the custodians looked at me and he said, well, I was walking through the cafeteria after lunch, and I saw a group of kids get up, and they left their trays behind. I reminded them, but they continued to walk away, so I stopped them, and I said, no one's going to pick up these trays. If you don't pick them up, they're going to stay on the table. So the kids went over, they picked up the trays, they went to the door, they opened the door, and they threw them outside. Turned to the custodian and said, are you happy now? The trays aren't there anymore. And the custodian just looked at me and he said, these are good kids. They would never have done this prior to the shooting. But what concerns me the most is they would never do that in front of the principal, in front of their teachers, or even in front of their parents. And he looked at me and he said, we see a different side of these kids, and we're really concerned about them, and we don't think that others know that. So what you will find is that different individuals have different ways of accessing and supporting children. And the bottom line is we want them all to be prepared to help kids when they're in distress. Let me go briefly over the psychological first aid actions as described by the American Red Cross. So the first one is observation or awareness. And the next slide I show is really going to go over some of the different types of symptoms that you may see or adjustment reaction. You then want to make a connection, help people feel comfortable and at ease, and be kind, calm, and compassionate. The reality is that people tend to pick up on the affective tone, how you speak, more than actually what you say when they're in distress. They often don't even hear what you're saying or process that information, but they do pick up on how you're saying it. So when you're dealing particularly with young children, but even older children and adults, if you can deliver the message in a calmer way that shows a little bit of confidence that everything's going to be okay to the extent possible, that actually can help people feel more comfortable. Then you want to assist with basic needs, and that's what I'm going to talk about on the next slide. You want to listen to children and adults to try and understand what their concerns are, and then give realistic reassurance. You don't want to give false reassurance. There's a tendency, particularly with children, that we keep telling them they don't need to be concerned or they shouldn't be worried. The reality is if something bad has happened and they are worried or they are upset, we should allow them to own those feelings. We can certainly give information that we feel might address the concerns that they have, particularly if those concerns are based on misunderstandings or misinformation or lack of information. But if they remain concerned, we should allow them to own those feelings, because only then can we give them advice about how to cope with those feelings. If we keep telling children that they shouldn't be upset, then we haven't helped them learn how to deal with an upset feeling. So what you want to do is give realistic reassurance, but then encourage good coping for the distress that remains. You also want to help people connect, help them identify supports in their family and for older children in particular, more broadly in the community, and help them figure out how they can best help others. Individuals who have been through crisis situations often derive comfort by being able to assist others. So you want to figure out how you can do that as well as another form of connection. You want to then give accurate and timely information. but you don't want to give unnecessary and graphic details. This is particularly with young children, but also with older children and even with adults. There's a tendency for us to try and see and listen to everything we can about a crisis event. But unfortunately, some of that information is just upsetting and doesn't actually help you understand the situation better, or more importantly, what you should do in that situation. So when I was talking with people in Las Vegas after the shooting, I said, listen to the news until you know what has happened, until you know then what you should do. So if you know what you should do at this point is reach out to others or donate blood, then turn off the television, turn off the radio, and look away from your phone and social media and go and do what you need to do at that point. These times are really times where we should be turning to personal connections with family and friends and other loved ones, as opposed to continually watching details about these events on media of all forms. You then want to suggest a referral resource to become aware of community mental health resources so you can offer them to families that you serve, and then end the conversation. So the idea behind psychological first aid is it's something you're really supposed to be able to do with someone you haven't met before and accomplish it in about 10 minutes. So what you want to do is be brief, be goal-oriented, connect, and help people move on to get the resources that they need. But a lot of these same principles and approaches apply when we're working with children in any type of crisis situation or when they're having distress of any kind. The next slide really talks about basic needs. I remember being asked in a meeting where we were planning for a tabletop activity for a chemical decontamination event. And so after they had gone through the whole situation, they asked me about the mental health needs of the people that were involved. So I said, well, let me see if I understand the situation. You've got 500 people. They're at an athletic event, and an announcement is made that even though they can't see or smell anything, they've actually been exposed to a chemical terrorist agent that may kill them and those they care about that are with them. All of their belongings that are on them, including their clothing, are removed, and they're hosed down with water in public. And the materials that are taken away from them are not going to be returned, at least in the near future. We don't take someone's cell phone and wipe the sarin off, nor do we do that with their home, with their keys to their home or to their car. So these individuals are now naked, they are wet, they are cold, they are scared, they're afraid that they are going to die and those they are with may die. They also are worried about those that they can't communicate with. They have no way of calling loved ones. They have no way of getting into their car, getting into their home. They don't have a driver's license. They don't have a credit card. They don't have cash. So at this point, they're really quite vulnerable. And so I said, I know what people need in those situations in terms of mental health support, and I don't have to ask them. I found that as I was doing this work, particularly at a federal level, people use a lot of acronyms. I personally don't like acronyms, but I decided that in order to fit in, I had to create an acronym. So I came up with UWF, which stands for Underwear First, or can also be called Brief Therapy, and that's a billing code under Medicaid. The issue is that individuals need their basic needs met before they're able to address their other emotional needs. And that could be safety, security, food, shelter, communication, and reunification with family and other loved ones. And staff, including professionals, have these same basic needs, and our crisis plans need to address them as a priority. And although that may seem like a flip comment that they need underwear first, I actually responded to one community that had had a major flooding. More than half of the parish was actually underwater in a community which had not had much flooding prior to that. And I was talking to a pediatrician that was overseeing the pediatric clinic that was established in the shelter. And she told me about one boy who had sickle cell disease and a high fever. And with sickle cell disease, they don't have the same immune system, children who have sickle cell disease. So as a result, they can go very quickly from a bacterial infection to sepsis, and it can be quite serious and even fatal. So they need to quickly get intravenous antibiotics in those situations. So the pediatrician was telling the mother that she needed to go immediately to the emergency department, and the mother was resistant. So the pediatrician just looked at her and said, you know your child well, and you know about sickle cell disease. Why aren't you going to the hospital right now? And she explained that her son was in the same clothes he had been in for several days, and he had actually become incontinent during the process. and she was going to wait in line first to get underwear before she would bring him to the emergency department. So it actually is, meeting basic needs is really important and often can stand in the way of meeting other social and emotional needs as well as even healthcare needs. Now the next slide really goes over some of the potential symptoms of adjustment reaction. Psychological first aid and basic needs go a long way to meeting the needs of most individuals, but there will be some who need additional emotional support, and this slide will help you identify and triage those individuals who may need assistance most. I do want to point out, though, that probably the symptom that is most common is not one that you see on the slide, and that is really no symptom. Even though individuals may not be showing any obvious signs of distress, they may still be in significant distress because distress is an internal state. It's how they feel, and they may hide that feeling from you. So individuals who have had significant exposures, for example, that witness the murder of a parent, for example, they would benefit from additional emotional support, and you shouldn't be waiting for them to demonstrate symptoms. But let me go over some of the symptoms that you may see. So one is sleep problems. That may be difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, frequent wakenings, difficulty wakening in the morning, nightmares, really any disruption in sleep. And when people have disrupted sleep, they often have difficulty functioning when they're awake. And so attending to the sleep needs of individuals, particularly by using good sleep hygiene practices, becomes sometimes very important as an initial step in helping people adjust to a traumatic event. Individuals who have also gone through a difficult event may demonstrate separation anxiety, and for children, school avoidance. Children who have been through traumatic experiences may be reluctant to separate from family and friends in order to attend school for fear that something will happen to them while they're separated from their parent or caregivers, or that something may actually happen to their parent or caregiver if the family is not intact to help each other. So I've been to situations where there's been natural disasters, for example, and a good percent of the children haven't returned to school. And it's really important that you do outreach in order to get them back into school. And I tell healthcare providers who work with children to be very reluctant to write letters excusing children from school because of school avoidance. Instead, what you need to do is to get them back to school as soon as practical, with the appropriate supports and accommodations so that it becomes a positive experience for them. So it's not necessarily they just return to school as if nothing had happened, but that you do get them back to school so that you're working on a transition plan and then returning to school. The next symptom I have on here is anxiety and trauma-related fears. And I think most people anticipate and would identify most of the trauma-specific fears. So for example, if there was a tornado that was causing the distress, they may become afraid when it becomes stormy weather. Now, children, though, may also become just fearful, so that you may find that a tornado has occurred during daylight, but children now are more afraid of the dark. And so that's more the anxiety part, that they become just more fearful. Children and adults will have difficulty with concentration after they've been through stressful situations, and that may show as a deterioration in academic performance. So the children may learn less or be less capable of learning new content, memorizing material, retaining information. Teachers also have a great deal of difficulty teaching. They have trouble concentrating on their lesson plan, whether it's preparing the lesson plan or delivering it without interruption. We can also see regression in children. And for those of you working with preschool-age children, I think you're quite familiar that stress does that to kids. So they may become incontinent if they had been toilet trained in the past. They might start sucking their thumb. But you can also see for older children and younger children as well, social regression. So even school-age children may now have problems with separation. Adults may become more irritable, less flexible, less tolerant of change, more self-centered. So you'll see that kind of spectrum of social and developmental regression. And sometimes that confuses adults, particularly with older children, because they may see the kids as, self-centered, focused on their own needs, and interpret that as they're not impacted by the event. But actually, paradoxically, it may be a sign that they are significantly distressed and in need of additional support. Obviously, when something tragic has happened, children may become sad and you may see depression. And for some children, the way it might manifest is avoidance of previously enjoyed activities. So things that brought them pleasure before, now they don't wish to do. Now, one of the challenges is, do they no longer wish to do it because they're either depressed or anxious or afraid to separate and leave their family to go do the things they used to do? So, for example, in Las Vegas, a lot of the kids didn't want to go to concerts anymore, but they also didn't want to go to athletic events. Any group event where there was a large audience was stressful for some children as well as for adults. So if children tell you it's just not fun anymore, you want to ask them what is fun, what brings them back into contact with peers that brings them enjoyment. So maybe they're volunteering to work with a youth outreach group, or they're doing something at their place of worship, or they're providing community service in some other way. And that might actually be a sign that they are doing well, but they have chosen to do things which they think are of more value. But if children just aren't doing anything with peers and aren't leaving the home, that's usually a red flag that you have to look more for signs of trauma. You can also see substance abuse. Children may initiate or increase the amount of substance use, whether that's cigarettes, alcohol, or other drug use. And I've seen that in adults as well. I remember talking to one adult, and basically what she told me, she was a mental health provider, and she was coordinating my visit to a community that had had a natural disaster. And so she told me that about 2 weeks after the flooding that had occurred in her community, her daughter called her on her cell phone one day after school and asked where she was. And the woman explained that she was at a bar at happy hour, and her daughter said, "Mom, you've been at a bar at happy hour ever since the flooding occurred, and you don't seem happy to me at all." And then she realized she was drinking too much. So you may see this in professionals as well, but obviously you can see them in children too. You may also see somatization. A lot of the individuals who are emotionally distressed may actually present with physical symptoms. So they may complain of fatigue, headaches, stomach aches, pain in other places. And so they often present to healthcare providers such as school nurses, pediatricians, or other community-based primary care providers. And we need to help them be better prepared to support children and families around their emotional distress so they can get the assistance that they need. Now, children may also demonstrate signs of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And this slide outlines the components that are required for the diagnosis. You first have to have exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. For children, that can be either that they're a victim, so for example, they were seriously injured in a car accident. They may have been a direct witness, such as viewing the death or murder of someone they care about, or they may actually just be informed about the event happening to someone close to them. So we have now broadened the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder so that merely being informed for children may be sufficient for exposure. And I think that one of the concerns that I have is that some people may over-apply the diagnosis of PTSD to actually represent other things that are happening in children's lives after a crisis event, and that may lead to the wrong allocation toward treatment and other interventions. So let me go over these criteria with that in mind, and I'm going to make comparisons to bereavement by a child whose parent, for example, has died in a car accident. They weren't present, they didn't witness it, but someone came home and told them about it. Now, they have to have symptoms in all four of the next areas for at least 30 days. That does not mean that you should wait 30 days. It just means you have to wait 30 days for the diagnosis of PTSD. But if people are having acute stress reactions and they're significant and impairing their day-to-day activity, you should still be intervening prior to the 30-day mark. So the first one is re-experiencing of the traumatic event. That can be through recurrent, intrusive, distressing memories or dreams. And in children, they don't actually have to remember the content of the dreams, let alone report them. So just having repetitive, scary dreams may be sufficient for the re-experiencing component. They don't need to have dissociative reactions, the flashbacks that are more common in adults. And they can also demonstrate it through post-traumatic play, where they recreate the event through their play. Now, having said that, children who have experienced the sudden death of a family member that's close to them may also have scary dreams. So that is a criteria that you may see in both bereavement as well as in post-traumatic stress disorder. The second is avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. They don't want to think about it, talk about it, and that's an important issue to recognize, is because that's why if you don't screen or at least ask about symptoms of post-traumatic reaction, you may not see it even in individuals who are, symptomatic and impaired by it, because they would need to tell you, and that's what they're trying to avoid doing. That's part of the core diagnostic criteria. I will say, though, with individuals who are grieving, they often don't want to talk about it either. So again, that won't discern between the two with 100% accuracy. You also see negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and that may be, for example, misunderstandings about the cause of the crisis event, which leads to guilt, or maybe intense reactions of shame or anger. And guilt is extremely common in individuals who are grieving as well, particularly in children, but also in adults. And the last one is a state of increased arousal, difficulty concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, self-destructive behavior, or hypervigilance or exaggerated startle reaction. And again, you can also see difficulty concentrating or sleeping in children who have experienced the death of someone close to them. So these criteria are important, and obviously post-traumatic stress disorder does increase after a traumatic event, and it causes significant impairment in many individuals and is an important focus of our attention. But the point I want to make is it isn't the only focus. There actually are a wide range of reactions and concerns well beyond post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic reactions. I went to one community shooting and was talking to a young man, and the person on either side of him had been shot and killed. He was unaware of what was going on until shortly after it was over, and he had been pulled to safety. And he went to school once over the 2 weeks since this had happened, but only stayed for about an hour, and he otherwise was home. And so he had also declined all counseling, on all offers of counseling. So I went to his house to visit with him, and I asked him why he wasn't going for counseling. And he said, well, I'm not really having any trauma symptoms anymore. And he said that he had had some trouble sleeping, he startled easily, but those things had kind of gone away after a couple days. And he said that he was going out with his friends that were at the event with him when the shooting occurred, and they were actually planning on going camping that weekend. So he said, I'm not afraid to go outside. I don't know why people keep assuming that. And I said, well, then why haven't you gone back to school? And he said he went back to school, but it didn't feel right being there without her. And I asked what he was referring to. Well, he was on a date with a girlfriend that he had known for many years and planned on marrying. And he said to be at school without her present didn't feel right. So I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked at me surprised and said, that's it. And if someone's willing to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling right now. But I don't want to talk about the shooting anymore. So the issue is he wasn't offered bereavement support, and I see that almost universally. After major crisis events, there's a big focus on the trauma aspect, and sometimes we ignore the bereavement side of it. But it isn't just trauma and bereavement. It's more than that as well. So if you go into a community, for example, that has had a large natural disaster, you'll find that there's a wide range of secondary losses and stresses that occur. Children may undergo a forced relocation because their home was damaged. Then they lose their peer network. They may have to attend a different school, and that often leads to challenges in learning and perhaps even academic failure. They have to integrate into a new social network that may not be very welcoming for them. They then have financial stress in the families very often because one parent is unemployed or underemployed, or they have uncompensated damages to their home. So that can lead to parental stress and mental health problems among the adults in the household. It can contribute to marital conflict and domestic violence. So if a child comes in to school or to daycare and they've been up all night because their parents were arguing because the mom lost her job because her business that she worked at was compromised because of the damage from the natural disaster, and the kid's worried that one parent is going to leave the home or that parents are going to get divorced, if you go back and talk with them about the day of the flood or the day of the tornado or the day of the fire, that may not be what's really bothering them. It's what's happening to them last night and today. And so you really have to not only attend to the needs that were precipitated by the event itself, but everything that follows that event. And these things apply even after shootings. I've seen schools have drop in enrollment because of a shooting that's occurred, and that leads to financial stresses in the community and in the school. Their budget is based on the number of students that attend, and when enrollment drops, that figure drops as well, and that often leads to layoff of some of the staff, which causes other stress. And so you can see these type of secondary losses and stressors after virtually every crisis event is significant in a community. And of course, you can see something similar in a family because they have, a family event or family crisis often is associated with secondary losses and stressors as well. And it isn't just everything that follows the event, it's also everything that precedes the event. I remember working with one school. The students had been on a field trip. They were high school students, and they were on a bus. And one of the girls was wearing a necklace that she had been given as a gift, and it had attached to it a bottle that was clear that had some liquid in it. And she became curious and decided to open the bottle. And at that point, when she opened the bottle, which was it actually contained the liquid concentrate of what's in pepper spray, and it was a personal protective device. You're supposed to open the bottle if you're being attacked or threatened. She did not apparently realize that or was curious. And so what happened was some of the individuals on the bus, some of the students started vomiting and got nauseous. Some kids had asthma attacks. So they evacuated the bus and went into a fast food restaurant. Unfortunately, the girl brought the bottle with her, and so they contaminated the fast food restaurant. Authorities were then contacted, and they were getting ready to do, an on-site decontamination. When she finally, explained what had happened, they closed the bottle, decided not to do an on-site decontamination, and they put the kids in a clean bus with the bottle closed, drove to an emergency department, and did a controlled decontamination. The girls waited on the bus, and one by one went into one shower outside the ambulance bay, and then changed into new clean clothing that they had somehow acquired. The boys also waited on the bus and went one by one into a different shower and then got dressed. The children then waited inside an auditorium watching cartoons. They had child life specialists, cookies and punch, and the teachers and chaperones were brought into the hospital and allowed to shower in private, and they changed. So everybody came together. No one had seen anyone undressed. No one had an embarrassing moment. They were reunited with their parents within 1 hour, and all of their belongings were returned to them, except one girl lost one boot. That was the whole event. And then 2 weeks afterwards, I was talking with some of the staff from the school, and they asked what they had done wrong, or what could they have done better. And I just looked at them and I said, teenagers, child life specialists, cookies and punch, cartoons, that was over the top. That was actually more than was needed. Could have just given them back their cell phones. They'll text their friends and talk about it, and they'll talk with each other. They don't really need child life specialists and social workers to be with them, but, it was fine to do that. I said, there was nothing you did wrong. In fact, I don't think there will ever be decontamination that goes that smoothly. And they said, no, they had 2 girls who were having panic attacks and hadn't been able to return to school. So even though I hadn't met the children, I said, I don't know them personally, but I will predict that it has nothing to do with that event. You merely uncovered something that was upsetting them prior to the event. Get to know these kids more and stop talking about that day. Well, one of the girls I didn't know very well because she had just transferred into the school. She transferred into the school that week, the week beforehand, because her mother was murdered the week beforehand. So I said, well, we understand. You're right. That's probably what's going on with her. But the other girl, she said, there wasn't anything going on. We've talked to the girl, we've talked to their parents, and they all say that there haven't been any stressors that she's had in her life. And I said, there have been. You just haven't found them yet. And then when I went back to visit them a week or 2 later, they told me that I was right, that actually the girl was being sexually assaulted by her father and had just disclosed it. So the point is that when you go to deal with a crisis event, you don't just deal with that event. You deal with everything that follows, and you deal with everything that precedes it. And that's part of why this work can be so tricky, is that you uncover everything, and it can feel very overwhelming, which is the reason why when we go to respond to major crisis events, we really try and do them in teams of at least 2, because otherwise it just feels like everybody is having issues. And it isn't just the children. It's the staff, It's the professionals that are working there. It's really everyone that's been involved in these events. Now, having said that, you would imagine, well, then everyone will look upset, but it's really not that way. This is one of the posters that Project Liberty put up about 6 months after September 11th in New York City, and they all had the same tagline, if only the signs were this easy to read, because they're not that easy to read. Children may actually withhold complaints about their emotional distress because of concerns that they're abnormal to have those feelings, or simply because they want to protect their parents who are also visibly upset, and they will do the same thing with their educators as well. Parents may not think that professionals are interested in hearing about these problems, even if they do notice them in their children, or assume that because a lot of the literature refers to these as normal reactions to abnormal events, that they should just deal with it. Because if it's a normal reaction and everyone's going through it, why would you call and ask someone for help with something that's normal? So I really avoid that phrase, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event, and instead I change it slightly. I'll say to someone, even psychologically healthy individuals such as yourself, if they find themselves in a position like this, are likely to experience significant distress. Unfortunately, we have strategies and approaches that can help you deal with that distress. Do I have your permission to bring someone in to talk with you about how to do that? And it's much more likely that people will give permission to that. But if you say, well, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event, do you need counseling? I think that there's so much stigma related to mental illness. It doesn't go away after a disaster. And so we really need to make sure that we enable people to accept the support that we have available. I remember seeing one girl, she was about 6 years old. She had come into a clinic for a scheduled appointment. She had been attacked by a pit bull dog a week prior, and her leg was badly injured and had required a lot of suturing in the emergency department when she presented a week prior. And she was coming back for a scheduled visit just to look at the wound. A physician who was in training had gone in and saw the girl and came out and asked me to take a look at the wound to make sure it was healing well. And I said, well, how's she doing otherwise? And, the resident looked at me and said, I asked the mother, and the mother said she's doing well emotionally. And then I paused and said, and I know you told us you can't just ask the mother, you have to ask the kid, because only people are the only ones who really know how they feel. And so I asked the girl, and she told me she was doing well emotionally, and she was not upset. So I said, nice job, and I went in, and the wound looked fine. I asked the mother how the daughter was doing, and she said, thank you. The other doctor asked. She's doing well, and I asked the girl, and I said, this must be really hard. How are you doing? And the girl just smiled and said, I'm doing fine, but thank you for asking. So at that point, right before I left, I just turned to the mom, and I asked her, how's she doing in school? And the mother said, I don't know how she's doing in school. And I said, well, why don't you know? And she said, well, she hasn't gone back to school. She won't leave the house. She's afraid she's going to be attacked by dogs. I said, well, how's she sleeping? She goes, well, she has a nightmare every night. She dreams dogs are attacking her. I asked her if she ever startled easily. And she said, oh, yeah. You drop something, close the door, slam something. She jumps. She's afraid dogs are coming in to attack her. So we then talked about how do you deal with those feelings. At the very end, right before I left, I turned to the mom and I said, look, please don't take this the wrong way, but for my own information, you had 2 doctors ask you and your daughter how she was doing, and both of you said fine, but it doesn't seem like she really was doing fine. Can you just explain to me why you answered the question that way? And she looked at me and said, oh, it's simple. Because if the dog had attacked you, you'd do exactly the same thing. The point isn't whether or not anyone might do it. The point is whether or not it's causing distress to you. And so I think that's just a reminder to me of how we try and normalize the reactions. And I think we normalize it to the point where that people are going to just see them as normal and then not ask for assistance with them. So it's kind of a fine line, but I think we do need to realize that just if we tell people, this is what you expect, we also have to follow that up with, but it's still difficult to deal with. And fortunately, we can assist you with that. Let me turn now to kind of the timeline, as I had mentioned. And so if you look at this slide, from point A to point B is a baseline. And it's not a straight line. Individuals will show sometimes more distress than they did the day before because they found out some bad news, or they're not feeling well, or something has happened that has been challenging for them or their family. So just because individuals are showing more emotional distress does not mean they are in crisis. A crisis is not defined by the event. It's really defined by the individuals, the families, the school or community's capacity to recover from the event without external support. That's where resilience comes in. So we have ups and downs, but let's say at point B, a crisis event has occurred, and that has overwhelmed the capacity of the individual to cope with that event. And then at point C, they feel vulnerable, and at D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. At that point, people tend to rally together and provide support and assistance. Neighbors talk to each other that they haven't met before. Support and assistance is provided. Donations are made. People reach out. And people start to do better. The problem is that even though they have improved functioning, for some individuals, they may actually become helpless and hopeless by point F. They may see that they've had some improvement, but question if they will ever return to their baseline. And that's actually when you see an increase in potentially suicide. So I know when I responded to Hurricane Katrina about 3 or 4 months after Katrina, and when I returned, people could list colleagues that they knew had died by suicide. There actually was a supplement to the journal Pediatrics that was dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself in New Orleans after Katrina. I'm not saying that suicide is very common, but it does underscore that just because individuals are doing better doesn't mean they're all better. And doesn't mean that the resilience will kick in even for children and bring them back to their baseline. If you withdraw the support too soon, which is characteristically what happens, for some individuals, they will just have continued impairment as their new baseline, and that's the level G that you'll see on the slide. We need to continue the support until individuals get back at least to their baseline, which is H. But for some individuals, they may actually surpass their baseline. And that's what we call post-traumatic growth, and which you'll see is the line labeled high. Individuals who have gone through traumatic events or loss, who have been able to cope effectively with it, are often more resilient to future adversity. They may actually find new priorities in life, new values that are more important to them because of their new views on what is really important in life. I was talking to a group of parents impacted by a major natural disaster, and they were foster parents. And one dad said, well, that's actually me, when I showed him this slide. And he explained that he had had a toddler who died of meningitis. And after his toddler died of meningitis, he decided he didn't really want to work in finance anymore. He was successful in finance and was financially doing quite well, but he decided it really didn't seem of that much value to him anymore. So he quit his job, he went back to college and became a kindergarten teacher. Because he said, shaping the development of young children is more important than making money. And I realize that now, after what I've been through. He then became a foster parent, and he was adopting a young child. So he had gone through post-traumatic growth. The reason that I think that's so important to point out to people is that just because these events occur, we are changed forever. These are life-changing events. We don't go back in time. We don't return to the way we were. We only can go forward. And we will be changed forever by these events, even children, even very young children. That does not mean, though, that they are damaged forever, but only that they have been changed. So our goal should not be to forget or go back in time, but rather incorporate some of the resiliency skills that makes us better prepared to deal with adversity in the future. Now, one of the problems with post-traumatic growth is that you've had to have had trauma to get there. And that gets into the next area that I wanted to mention, is the importance of professional self-care. The example I gave was of someone in finance who experienced the sudden death of his toddler and decided to become a kindergarten teacher. And I will say from my experience, whether it's pediatricians and other pediatric healthcare providers, nurses, teachers, school mental health providers, many of them have had traumatic experience or losses during their childhood. And that has shaped them so that they now want to spend their life helping others. They realize that someone helped them when they were young, or they realize that someone didn't, and they want to be that someone for another child at another point. So a lot of people that are in the helping professions are ones that have already had distress themselves during their childhood. And as I mentioned, a crisis event can unsurface the distress you've had in the past. That is the same for the provider. We need to recognize it's distressing to be with children who are in distress, and it's critical that staff find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children, whether they be grieving or traumatized. And we have to create a culture where it's okay to be upset, and where members normalize asking for help and model willingness to accept assistance. I remember talking at one conference, and at the end of the conference, a number of people stayed to ask questions. And there was one man who waited until everyone else was gone. And I asked him how I might be able to be of assistance. And he explained to me that he was a superintendent in a school system where there had been a major bus accident where a number of students had died. This was actually outside the United States. And he said that it bothered him at the time, but then he started to, recover from that. But then he looked at me and he said, but it still bothers me from time to time. And he was tearful at this point, and he said, maybe I should just retire from being a superintendent. My comment to him was, if you wake up one day and you don't care if kids die in your school system, that's the day you should retire. We can't not care. Not caring doesn't actually protect us from compassion fatigue. It actually makes it harder for us to see value in what we do, and that may actually even exacerbate some of our distress. The problem is not caring. The problem is if that caring causes you distress, it makes it hard for you to do your job and to feel good about yourself. So what I'm going to do before I open it up to questions is just share some resources that you may wish to look at for further information. As mentioned, I direct the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and we have a website, schoolcrisiscenter.org, which has a number of resources on there. For example, we have, at the top, we do have resources on how to support kids if there's been a terrorist attack or a shooting that they read about in the media. There's one now on how to deal with grief during the holidays. There's also the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. Our center coordinates that coalition, and you'll find that at grievingstudents.org. And there's over 20 video-based modules on how to support grieving children. Although it is written for the education field, it's also endorsed by one of the supporting organizational members is the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, as well as Child Care Aware. And so I would encourage you to look there for resources on how to support children around grief. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has a Children in Disasters webpage, which also has a particular page just on coping and adjustment. This is a screenshot of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement's website, and you can see either I need help now or help me prepare, and you'll find that information. And then the last slide is just background information and contact information for the center. We have a toll-free phone number that's answered after hours by Children's Hospital Los Angeles hospital operators. You can contact us if you would like advice on dealing with a crisis event. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, we're LinkedIn, so please visit us, call us, like us, share us. Please help get information out about the center. And what I'm going to do now is turn back to Zola so that she can take some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to transition into the Q&A session. Please continue to type your question in the Q&A box.
So let me start with one question that I see was the question about whether 30 days is a long time to diagnose or wait to diagnose someone with traumatic stress. I want to clarify, it's 30 days to get post-traumatic stress disorder. You can still see traumatic stress immediately after the event and prior to 30 days. And again, you don't want to wait the 30 days. Part of the reason for the 30-day period for post-traumatic stress disorder is stress reactions are so common that they don't want to give it a diagnosis of a disorder until it has persisted for a period of time. But again, you want to be able to provide that support immediately and not wait for the diagnostic criteria for PTSD to be met. So in terms of the material being copyrighted, I have actually provided a handout version that doesn't include, for example, the picture of the poster, which is, I assume, copyrighted by Project Liberty, although that's through FEMA funding. So I'm not really sure of whether that's copyrighted, but there is a handout version that you are free to use with others. And I don't know if the people overseeing this can explain how you get a copy of that, but I have provided that. And then I see a question here about following up on how you said most children show no symptoms. And the question was about what percentage of children do show symptoms after a traumatic event. Well, actually, they did an interesting study in New York City schools after September 11th. They surveyed over 8,000 students that were in grades 4 through 12. They used a passive consent process so that they really had a very representative sample of children from all 5 boroughs. And they found that about 87%, so nearly 9 out of 10 of the children, reported that 6 months later they still had at least one traumatic symptom, whether that was sleep problems, difficulty going out in public, reluctance to talk about the event. That was just under 1/2 of the children were still reluctant to talk about the event. So you will find high rates of at least a trauma symptom. In terms of the number of children that had sufficient symptoms to meet the diagnostic criteria for either post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, or agoraphobia, going out in public, or fear of public spaces, they found that 6 months out, approximately 250,000 children qualified for at least one of those diagnoses in the school system. It's about 1 in 4 children. They had 1.1 million students at the time. They found that the rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression were approximately 10%, and the rates of agoraphobia, or fear of going out in public, was about 15%. Just to give you some ballpark, so the bottom line is it's very high numbers, and these were based on self-reports of the students, and also based on the children also saying in those reports that they had some change in their day-to-day functioning. So it was considered actually to be a conservative estimate. And so the other thing which I think was most telling of those results was that the majority of children that self-reported those symptoms also reported that they had never sought help. And that's despite the fact that Project Liberty had free mental health services in all of the schools. So the bottom line is, yes, we should be screening and identifying those in need of further treatment, but we also have to be delivering support to all of the children, because most of them will actually not seek care outside of their school and their daycare centers and their community setting. So the benefits and timing for introducing art therapy to students impacted by a crisis, I don't know specifically on art therapy, but supportive therapy is something that you probably want to start early on. My caution is just if you're not trained in using those modalities, you should be cautious about thinking you're doing art therapy if what you're really doing is using art as a modality for self-expression, and you need to be careful about how you interpret interpret their art back to them, or how you use it to try and change how they're feeling or thinking. It's one thing to give children crayons and finger paints to allow them to express how they're feeling. It is another then to use it as art therapy. But I'm not aware of any need to delay the use of these therapies, because it's usually a period of time before they seek them or get into those therapies anyway. The distinction in behavior symptoms between trauma related to disaster and behaviors and symptoms related to intergenerational trauma. Let's see if I can see the rest of that question. Do disasters exacerbate existing trauma symptoms? Yes. Disasters and other crisis events will often bring to the surface prior unresolved feelings about trauma and loss, and it can be exacerbated by intergenerational issues. So when I've gone to schools, for example, that have had shootings that have involved Native American communities, the intergenerational trauma of those communities exacerbates their adjustment and coping. Same thing if you're in a community of minorities or predominantly minorities that have been in poverty or disadvantaged, it makes it harder for them to deal with the current event. And so, yes, that would be one of the pre-existing stressors that is important to think about. Have you seen successful post-disaster trauma awareness campaigns anywhere in the country that were effective in opening up the dialogue in the community that helped drive programming? Well, I do think that the work that was done in New York City post 9/11, such as the posters that I talked about, we did a lot of work. I actually coordinated the training for New York City schools for their school crisis teams after 9/11, and we did over 55 full-day workshops for teams across New York City schools and trained teams in over 40 of their school districts. They had just over 40 school districts, and we trained them in each of those districts. We had created a citywide team, and we also did teams in over 1,000 schools were trained. And I think a lot of that work continued to provide some other support. In terms of preparing students to support students 3 to 4 months out from a natural disaster, I think this training is hopefully helpful in that way. You'll find a lot of material on supporting educators to support grieving students at grievingstudents.org, and all of those training materials are free of charge. There even are some PowerPoint presentations that if you open them up in the notes view, you'll find the whole lecture embedded there that can be used. And so in terms of specifically on natural disasters, there is a webinar that I did that's available online through the National Center for Disaster Medicine and Public Health on providing psychosocial support after disasters to children. You'll find that at the American Academy of Pediatrics website. And then the next one says, I was at a museum in DC recently and found a lost girl. And what do you do if they're not going to communicate? Well, if somebody is, it depends on the age of the child, but a very young child who you find may be afraid of strangers or very upset. They've been separated from their parents. So I think you use the same strategies and approaches you'd use for the first day in the preschool program. You would get down to their level, you'd talk softly, you would offer their assistance, you might offer your hand, but if they're not comfortable with that, you just want to make sure that they're safe, and I would work on reunification at that point and looking for parents. And then, was your successful work post 9/11 used in Sandy or Harvey relief efforts? I did a lot of work after Hurricane Sandy and after Hurricane Katrina. I think I went to New Orleans more than a dozen times. And I did go to New Jersey and New York City after Sandy and did some training there. As I already mentioned, actually the foster parent group that I met with was after Superstorm Sandy. I have not yet gone out or been asked to go out to Texas around Harvey, but I would be happy to do that if anyone is interested. And then it's the same thing. I've a question about Maria. I've reached out to Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Florida, and Texas, and have offered support and assistance to them. And so if any of you have connections there and would like us to help, please contact me directly. And I just spoke to someone today about San Antonio for a future presentation I'm doing there at the beginning of next year. But we would be happy to provide assistance and support. And I should have said that when you contact our center and ask for consultation and technical assistance, that's actually provided at no charge. And then for major disasters, we've even responded to the events covering all of our travel expenses and do that at no charge as well. And that's thanks to the funding that we've gotten from the New York Life Foundation. Have we worked with military-connected children? I have actually done presentations at Fort Hood and Fort Tripler. I don't work a great deal, though, specifically with military-connected children, but we have created, if you look at grievingstudents.org, you will find that there's, under additional modules, you will find one that's on supporting children who are grieving the death related to the military. So we worked on that with several groups that, with DODEA, the Department of Defense Educational Administration, the Military Child Education Coalition, and TAPS to develop that module, which is available, again, free of charge under additional resources at grievingstudents.org. I think I've answered all the questions. Sorry if I missed one. Oh, there was one about finding resources in our area to refer families after a disaster. That I am not, I would imagine that FEMA would assist you with that, and other responders to the disaster. But in terms of bereavement, if you're looking for resources around that, if you look at external resources at grievingstudents.org, they'll connect you with the Moyer Foundation resource, kind of resource center. And there actually is a map of the country, and if you click on the state, you'll be able to download a PDF that lists all the pediatric bereavement centers that are in the state. I'm not as familiar that we have I'm not as familiar with resources that more broadly help with disasters. And I think it would depend on whether you're looking for trauma treatment or whether you're looking for resources to help with immediate and basic needs. But I think a very good place to start is going to be your pediatric healthcare provider. So we've done a lot within the American Academy of Pediatrics, as I mentioned earlier. And so there are actually clinical guidance on how to provide psychosocial support after disasters for pediatricians. And I had the opportunity to be the first author on that, as well as one on bereavement. And so you'll find that pediatric healthcare providers are often a good place to start with looking for resources in your community, as well as your school system or your early education center. I think at this point I did hit all of the questions. Zola, did you have anything else that you wanted to mention?
I think there was actually one question. What is the best way to contact you?
All right. The best way to contact me on the title slide is my email address, or you can contact me through the center. So what I will do now is, you can just do info at grievingstudents.org, or you can, that will come to me as well as to 2 other people, just in case I'm out of the country or not accessible. And I've also given you my personal email address at work. Either one of those will be fine. The first one, the info one, goes to a couple people so that you'll get backup if I'm not readily available, but the other one comes directly to me.
Thank you. I've also copied that within the questions pod. Looks like you have one more question.
Okay, so this this question has to do with communities that have had pre-existing or chronic problems, either because of a limited infrastructure or disenfranchised. And yes, these are communities that I refer to as ones that have experienced either chronic trauma or chronic loss or cumulative loss. There is a tendency in those communities to often, for people to say, well, kids are used to this. They don't get used to the death of someone they care about or to major trauma. They just start to realize that no one's going to necessarily do anything to help them, so they stop asking or seeking that help. I remember going to one community that is known for chronic gang violence, and I expressed that view, and someone in the audience said, you don't understand our community. It's normal here for children to be in gangs. And I said, and then he looked at me and said, it's normal here for children to murder other children. And I looked at him and I said, it's never normal for children to murder other children. That is not a normal thing. And as soon as we call it normal, then it means we don't have to do something about it. And as far as I'm concerned, that will never be acceptable to me, and really shouldn't be acceptable to anyone, in my opinion. And I think what happens is these kids, they often will say, well, the teenagers, they're so used to it, they feel invulnerable. Actually, what happens is kids that are overwhelmed may actually engage in the same behaviors that place them at risk just to prove that they can survive. You see counterphobic behavior, reactive risk-taking. So one, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why children may join gangs is to place themselves in the situations that they expect to be inevitable to prove that they can survive and reassure themselves. So what happens is that these experiences are not only cumulative, but they're multiplicative. And that individuals who have not been able to get the effective support that they need and to resolve or cope with those events, not necessarily resolve them, are more prone to have difficulties when they have subsequent stressors in their lives. And that's why these communities need our support even more. And I will say I went to one community, and they said, what do we call it when 20 children get murdered in a privileged community? We call that a national crisis. What do we do when that happens in our community? We call it a day. And there is this sense of feeling disenfranchised, not even feeling that it's appropriate for you to have distress or to grieve makes it harder to cope with the event. And there's no question about that. And so I really think that we need to not only look at communities where they thought it would never happen, but we have to go to communities where we know it happens and provide even more support. So I see another question about what about children who have gotten through the crisis and now start to show at-risk behaviors 6 months afterwards. You can have delayed presentations for risk behaviors as well as for all of those reactions that I went through. Sometimes children do not even process it or show that they're processing it until some time has passed because they may be waiting until the adults around them are more stable and they feel it's safe to show it. Or they may start to feel more at risk as they understand what's happened better. And those risk behaviors can be not just, speeding in cars or drinking and driving or, getting into gang violence. The risky behaviors can just be not anticipated to the same extent. I know in one school where they had a major shooting, they found the kids were sitting in shop class and they had tiles that were kind of on the ceiling that it kind of looked more like cork. And a lot of schools have that. And what they found were the kids were taking picks and screwdrivers and they were tossing them into the air to impale them on the roof, on the ceiling. And the person who was looking at me said, but they must realize eventually they're going to fall down and they can really hurt people. And I looked at him and I said, of course they know that. That's why they're doing it. I mean, so there was a certain amount where they were taking risks because they felt vulnerable. And so sometimes that risk behaving is not exactly what you would expect, but you may see it in multiple areas.
I think that's it for the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the audience. We had great participation. You can also download a handout version of the presentation through the file pod. What you do is you click the file and then press download file. Right now I want to transfer over to a poll. This is voluntary. Feel free to take a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes,